Okay, good morning everybody. If you expected to see Chris today, I apologise. You've got me instead. Chris sent an email yesterday, Sunday evening, to say that there's been a slight change of plan. I was due to do the class next Monday, but because of various circumstances, I'm doing it today, and Chris's class will be next Monday instead. So for those of you who don't know me, good morning. My name is Gary Merrill. I'm a senior lecturer here at Roehampton and also the programme convener for MA Journalism. And I'm going to talk to you today for about an hour or so, 50 minutes, about the noble art of interviewing. Now, interviewing can be a little bit daunting. I'm trying to put myself in your position. If I was 20, 21 and was faced with interviewing senior journalists, I'd probably find that a little bit daunting. But if you follow my guidance today and think about how it relates to your own project, it can be very rewarding. And I'm going to give you a few hints and tips and some guidance today on how to do it. So as always, this class is accompanied by a PowerPoint, which you can find on Moodle under week 5 interviewing, and I'm also recording this class as well in the form of a video. And what I do, everybody does it slightly differently. All my colleagues do it slightly differently. I record it on video and then I edit it together with the PowerPoint and make a sort of a TV program essentially, and put it onto YouTube that you can access from the comfort of your own homes. Okay, so without further ado, let's move on to slide number 2. And a good way to do your interviews before you do anything is to sit down really old school style, just like going back to the Stone Age, with a pen and a piece of paper, believe it or not. Or I guess you can do it on a laptop if you prefer, but please don't do it on a phone because they're so small and unwieldy and so on. But sit down with a pen and paper and just sketch out what you need to do, what information you need, and also a sort of schedule, a 1, 2, 3 step-by-step schedule. And really, when you think about interviews, like with many things, there are 3 stages to the process. So what you don't want to do is just kind of dive into it and sort of randomly contact people and randomly ask them questions, because it won't generate the results that you'd hope for. So essentially there are 3 stages. There's the pre-interview, so things that you need to do before you do your interviews. There are things that you need to do during the interview when you're actually interacting with the subject of your interview. And then there are things that you need to do after the interview. So think about it as those 3 stages. And it's a bit like the classic novel or the classic movie. People who study English literature, they call it the 3-act play. You know, the classic story is boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back. So in a way, this is the 3-act play in the context of interviews. Excuse me. So let's look first at the pre-interview stage. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this show is, I think there's 15 altogether, 15 key points about interviewing that if you follow them will help you on your way. Now the first point, and it's a question, and this is kind of obvious, but through my experience I found that sometimes students sort of neglect the obvious. And the question that you need to ask yourself before you even think about interviews is, are they relevant to your topic? So for example, if you're doing if your dissertation is about looking at content, for example, something that's been big in the news this year for good reason, Black Lives Matter. So if you were doing a dissertation that looked at the BBC's reporting of Black Lives Matter, or the Guardian's reporting, or the Sun, or whoever, you've only got 9,000 words in your interview. So I guess it could be interesting to interview journalists and to interview people involved in the protests. But your focus is going to be on the content, the words that were used in the articles, in the journalism, to see how the journalists described the protests, whether they were in favour, whether they were sympathetic, whether they were critical or whatever. So really key point, and it's absolutely fundamental. if interviews are relevant to your topic, then, you know, continue with this slideshow essentially. But if it's a content-based, if your dissertation is a purely content-based dissertation, then interviews aren't going to be relevant. So please don't feel, you know, obliged to have interviews in your dissertation, because they might not be appropriate. So just to clarify, you do not need to do interviews if you're looking at content only. Now, I don't know what all your topics are. Chris obviously does, because he's in charge of the module. But just think it through. If you're doing content only, then interviews, they might be interesting, but they won't necessarily be relevant. And don't forget, you've only got 9,000 words. And you might be thinking, oh, 9,000 words, that's the longest piece of work that any of you have done, probably. So it seems really daunting, and it seems like you've got lots of words to play with, but you'll be amazed how quickly those words you eat through those words in the course of your dissertation. So key point number one, are interviews relevant to your topic? And you can decide that, if you are doubtful, by discussing it with your supervisor. So discuss it with your supervisor if you have any doubts, and he or she will point you in the right direction. So that's point number one. It seems really obvious, but it is very, very important. So second point, and again, I make this point based on my experience of supervising, countless dissertations over my many long years. And what tends to happen if you ask students to interview somebody, or if you direct students to interview somebody, invariably, and I would have done the same thing when I was 20, 21 years old. So if you're going to interview somebody, I don't know, about, let's go back to Black Lives Matter, about how the Black Lives Matter protests were covered by the journalism, by media, your temptation might be to look around you where you live, and your friends and your parents and your mum and your dad and your family. Now, with all due respect to your friends and your mum and dad and your family, they're not really what you call experts. They'll have an opinion, which is fine, and everybody's entitled to an opinion, but they won't necessarily give you great insight into the journalism process. So, for example, if you ask your mum, and I'm sure she's a lovely woman, but if you ask her, you know, what do you think, why do you think journalists do what they do? She'll give you an answer, but unless she's a journalist, she's not necessarily going to be able to enlighten you. So the question there, the first question in the blue box, when you're thinking about your dissertation and think about, you know, what you want to achieve, who are the best people to enlighten you? So who knows about journalism? Who knows about how and why journalists do what they do? And that basically there's two groups of people. There's academics like me and Chris and our colleagues, or if you want it direct from the practitioners, then obviously it's the journalists. So if you want to know why journalists in the, say, Daily Mail reported Black Lives Matter in a certain way, then you need to speak to the journalists from the Daily Mail. You know, like I said, other people have opinions on it, but if you really want to know the thought processes, which is what interviews are really good at, is to understand people's thought processes, how they come up with ideas and why they do what they do, then you need to speak to the journalists at the Daily Mail. My second point here is to aim high. Now I say this because when I did my PhD, when was it? Quite a long time ago now. Well, not that long ago, 7 years ago. In my PhD, I interviewed 26 journalists. Now, don't get freaked out by that. You don't need to interview 26 journalists. A PhD, as you probably know, is about that thick. It's basically a book. And in terms of length, it is literally 10 times longer than what you're required to do for your dissertation. So I and every other PhD student have many more words to play with, and we're also required, because a PhD is kind of up here somewhere. It's like the Olympic Games. If you're Commonwealth Games, you know, BA, European Games might be MA, PhD is Olympic Games. You're expected to do it in great depth as well. So I interviewed 26 journalists, and I wanted to know essentially why they do what they do. My area was economics and business journalism. So I made a list of journalists that I wanted to talk to, and I aimed high. So I'm not, no offence to these people, but I'm not interested in local newspapers or the local radio station. So I got in touch, found the email addresses of the senior BBC journalists. senior Guardian journalists, senior Telegraph journalists. So these are literally, their title is senior journalist, senior correspondent or editor. So you may have heard of some of the people that I approached. Robert Peston, for example. He was working at the BBC at the time, and I got in touch with Robert, and he very kindly replied to my email. Unfortunately, we couldn't figure out a schedule because he was very busy and and difficult to pin down. But I did interview some other very senior BBC journalists who you've probably seen on the screen. So I say aim high. Now, I don't know, maybe because I was doing a PhD, and maybe because I'm a bit older, a lot older, maybe these journalists gave me a bit of their time, and as young journalism students you might struggle, but I do still urge you to aim high. So going back to my example, so if you are looking at the BBC's coverage, watch TV obviously and listen to the radio and make a note of the journalists' names, and see if you can track them down via their email addresses, Twitter accounts and so on. But the caveat here is to be realistic. So for example, with all due respect to you folks, I don't think that the Director General of the BBC will give you his time to discuss the editorial direction of the corporation. So be realistic. And likewise, if you're interested in politics, Boris Johnson, you might want to talk to him. He's going to be a little bit busy at the moment and he probably won't get in touch. But there again, you know, if you try and get in touch with your local assembly member for the London Assembly, he or she might be make themselves available. And likewise, other less senior journalists as well. And finally, the final point on this slide is have a plan A. So in other words, aim high. But have a plan B and a plan C as well. So if people in your A list aren't available to talk to, then you should have a B list, a second choice, a second stream, if you like, of people that you can talk to or at least approach. But going back to the key point on this slide, focus on experts. Go to people who know about what you want to find out about, if that makes sense. So much as I respect your parents and your family and your friends, right, that they will have an opinion, but it won't necessarily enlighten you about why journalists do what they do. Okay, so let's move on. Slide number 3. Oh, I'm sorry, slide number 5. Yeah, and this is point number 3. This is an extension really of my last point. And what I've said here is avoid vox populi. That phrase, vox populi, is Latin. I think it means literally the popular voice. And sometimes it's abbreviated to vox pop. Now, vox pop, you will all be aware of what this is. You might not know it's called vox pop. But funnily enough, I heard it last night when I was listening to the radio with the election, the American election coming up on Tuesday. And there was a journalist in Pittsburgh, I think. And she said, I'm out on the streets of Pittsburgh and I want to know what people think about the election. And she shoved the microphone under somebody's nose and they say, oh, you know, I think Donald Trump is fantastic and we're going to give him it. And then she shoved the microphone under somebody else's nose and they said the opposite. And they thought that Trump was a bit of a loser and Joe Biden was their man. That's a vox populi. That's a vox populi. So this kind of links into my previous slide. So the key point here, folks, everybody's entitled to an opinion, absolutely 100%, you know, and there's a huge variety of opinions in the world. Thank goodness we live in a pluralistic liberal society, thank goodness. But some people, your average person on the street, they don't necessarily have great insight. An example I'll use here, you know the TV program The Apprentice. I think it's starting again this week. And it's one of those TV programs that I watch. I really shouldn't, because it kind of annoys me and it frustrates me in many ways. Because the people, you know, right at the beginning of the program, the dramatic music comes on and the voiceover says, you know, this is Britain's brightest business brains. And, and you watch it and you follow their exploits week by week. And they are far from the Britain's brightest business brains. If they are, then we're all in trouble. Because they do some ridiculously foolish things. And I remember a couple of years ago, there was an example and I forget what the product was, but they were out on the street. Basically, they went out and they come up with this product. They went out on the streets and they asked 3 people, I think it was a food or something, about the flavour of it, the taste, and then they went back to the boardroom and did their presentation to Lord Sugar, and they said, well, our market research has proven that this is, it's very popular and people like it, and Lord Sugar demolished them, and he said, how can you say that 3 people on the street are a representative sample? And he's absolutely right, and you see this all the time. Now, if you watch TV adverts, for example, I don't watch adverts about shampoo, obviously, but I do notice them, and you'll notice, particularly shampoo aimed at women, it'll say at the bottom, 87% of women said that this product gave them glowing, shining hair. And then you actually look at the small print, and it's like a sample of 60 or 50 or even 100. And that's incredibly deceptive. So you have to be very, very careful with surveys, whether it's going out on the streets, vox populi, asking 3 people, or whether it's these sort of pseudo-scientific surveys that they have on shampoo adverts, or pet food for that matter. So just be really, really, really careful. And a few years ago, when I was doing my PhD, I said to my professor, we were talking about surveys, and I was starting to think about doing my own survey. I forget what it was for, what the purpose of it was, and he said, just be really, really careful. He said, and he's a bit of an expert in surveys, and he said, to have a credible survey, the magic number for him is 600. So unless you can do a survey that incorporates the views of 600 or more people, then it is questionable whether that survey is representative. Think about the hair adverts. 87% of 68 people, that's not many. You really need to have a much bigger sample. So just to recap on this one, so avoid vox populi, because they don't really tell you much. It's quite a superficial way of, they're not really interviews, just shoving the microphone under the nose of somebody walking down the street. Think about my example from The Apprentice. 3 or 4 people as a sample is not really a sample. Think about the shampoo adverts, and also think about that magic number. And basically, you don't have time or the word count to be doing surveys of 600 plus people. It's actually quite hard work. That's not to say, however, that you can't use surveys in your dissertation, but take a more sort of intelligent, measured approach, and you'll find, if you do a little bit of investigation online, next slide, number 6, that there are loads of surveys out there already. The experts have done these surveys for you, and there are some really, really good ones. I think they're freely available, but you can certainly pick up plenty of survey material online if you do a little hunting around. So top left there, you've got an organisation called YouGov. So Google YouGov and see what you find. And the last time I looked, which was a while ago, but they have a list, of surveys that have been done asking the general public about certain things. So, for example, what's in the news at the moment, COVID, obviously. Do you think that the British government, has performed well during the COVID crisis? And they'll divide it down into Conservative supporters and Labour supporters and so on. So have a look at YouGov. Top right, British social attitudes. This has been going for many years. And this is, I find this one fascinating because it shows how, as the title suggests, how Britain's attitudes have changed over time. And one of the most significant changes is, if you look back 50 years, back to where are we, 1970 or so, you look at British social attitudes towards ethnic minorities, believe it or not, and thankfully they've actually improved quite dramatically over the last 50 years. It might not feel like it sometimes, particularly in the context of Black Lives Matter, but thankfully the British society has moved on, and likewise with LGBT, attitudes to LGBT people have moved on as well. So there's various organisations that specialise in surveys online. So instead of doing your own, have a look at what's been done already, and you can quote those in your dissertation. Now I'm getting off the subject of interviews a little bit here, so let's move back to interviews specifically. So slide number 7, point number 4. Excuse me. Point number 4, this is really important. Be aware of the quantity of words spoken. And essentially, the golden rule, the rule of thumb, if you like, is that for people generally at normal speaking speed, velocity, whatever you want to call it, we speak about 100 words a minute. So 10 minutes, that's 1,000 words. 100 minutes, I'm trying to do this in my head, 100 minutes will be 10,000 words. There's your dissertation. You know, so just be aware that if you interview somebody and they speak for an hour, that's what, in my calculation, 6,000 words. To put that into real life, as I said before, for my PhD I interviewed 26 journalists for about an hour each. Now some of the time I was talking, but for the vast majority of the time they were talking. And I recorded it on my voice recorder, and then I listened back to it time and time again. You are not going to use, and I didn't use all of those words, you know, because when people speak, when you interview them, quite often their language is kind of filled out with hesitations, and you know, they go back on what they said and they reiterate and so on. So you don't have to use every single word that everybody speaks, but just be aware that if you are going to do interviews, it's a heck of a lot of words. People can speak more in a set time than they can write. So it's just be aware of the volume of the words. Next slide, number 8. So my real life example, 26 interviewees, 1 hour each. I asked everybody the same 10 questions. That's 6,000 words per person. That's 156,000 words. My whole dissertation, my whole PhD was only 100,000 words. So there is no way that I could use all of those words. So what you have to do, which I'll come on to in a minute, is to be selective, but whilst maintaining the integrity of what they say. You can't just, you know, reduce 100,000 words down into 10, you know. So that there is a technique there, which I'll talk about in a minute. And on the right hand side, yeah, I just emphasised every minute of speech generates around 100 words. Some people speak really quick, so they might do 150 words a minute. Some people speak really slow, so it might only be 80 words a minute. But generally speaking, a minute equals 100 words, so a 20-minute interview is going to generate 2,000 words. Just be aware of that. It's a heck of a lot of quantity of words when you think about it. So slide number 9, slide number 9, point number 5, and something else to think about in the pre-interview stage. All interview material, I say all, is subjective, and this is a big debate these days about fake news, about what's true and what's not true. And subjective, as you know, it means from the subject, from the individual's point of view, so it's what I believe. Objective means something which is true for everybody. It's the facts, essentially. So when you're interviewing people, just be aware that it's their perception. And one of the phrases which I really don't like to see in dissertations or any academic work, in the social sciences at least, is when students says, you know, this journalist said this, and therefore it proves that the BBC is biased, or it proves that the Daily Mail doesn't like the Black Lives protest movement. It doesn't. It might hint at it, it might suggest at it, and it certainly might be a relevant perspective, but it doesn't prove it. So what you really need to do, this is the reason that you interview multiple people, is that you can interview like 10 people, maybe not for a BA dissertation, 3 people from the BBC, and they'll give you kind of similar answers, but they might give slightly different answers as well. So don't forget, we're dealing with people. People are, you know, emotional, changeable, sometimes prejudiced individuals. So just because somebody says something, it doesn't prove it. Particularly, think about this as well, particularly somebody in seniority, just because Donald Trump says something, just because he's president, doesn't prove anything. Do you remember what he said about injecting bleach? I still can't believe that. To cure COVID, you know, just because he's president, I mean, he's not a scientist, it's a ridiculous thing to say. So just because a person in authority says something, it doesn't prove anything. So just before you go into your interviews, remember that all material is subjective. Yes. Point number 6, slide number 10. It actually takes quite a long time to get your questions right, and what you shouldn't do, what you really shouldn't do, is when you've organised your interview, you're probably 99% sure going to do it online or on the phone. Put some preparation into your question. Don't just turn up for your interview and just kind of wing it. Just think, well, we'll just have a chat. We'll just, I don't need to structure it. We'll just have a general chat because this person seems like a nice bloke, or whatever. That will be an absolute disaster, because you'll finish the interview and you'll realise at the end that you haven't got the information that you need. So what you need to do is to sit down. The first step, I would say, is to sit down again with that Stone Age pen and paper and write down what do you want to find out about from the interviewees. Try and do it in sequence. So 1, 2, 3, A, B, C, however you want to do it, and get the wording right. And it's, believe it or not, it's actually quite difficult. It's quite time consuming to write the perfect question. And again, going back to my PhD, I had 10 questions. I actually had more, but I reduced them because some of them were a little bit superfluous. But it took me a while to get the phrasing right. And I spoke to my supervisor. I checked with him to make sure that they were questions which would generate the right sort of information. So it's really, really important that you write your questions down, and that if you are interviewing multiple people, that you ask them the same question. Then you can do a valid comparison between their answers. So think about the sequence, think about the wording. Words are really powerful. As journalism students, you know that, right? So you want to drop any judgmental words from your questions. Any words that you might say something like, what do you think of the BBC's shocking journalism around the Black Lives Matter protests? That word shocking, that's a very powerful word, and it basically says that you've decided that it's shocking. It'd be much better just to drop that. What do you think of the BBC's coverage of Black Lives Matter? That's going to get you a much better answer than putting a word like shocking in there. And speak to your supervisor, so he or she will give you guidance on fine-tuning your questions. So next slide, some examples of interview questions. Now please don't think that you need to or want to duplicate exactly what I've done here. This is a screen grab from the interview questions for my PhD. You'll notice 3 things at the top. It says notes for interviewees. What I did is I read those points out to the interviewees before we started the question. So academic convention dictates that your comments will be anonymous. Second point, the initial questions are relatively open-ended. Interpret them as you think fit, and apologies if I interrupt, blah blah blah. And then what I've done is listed the questions in sequence, sometimes part A, part B. But look at the way that I've phrase them. Believe it or not, they might seem quite intuitively reasonable, but they did actually take quite a lot of work on my part and discussion with my supervisor to get the phrasing absolutely right. So think about something like question 2B. Why do you think these stories were left out of the schedules? That's quite an open-ended question. That invites the interviewee to ponder, to think, and to expand on his or her own experience. Then the next question, 3A, what determines the angle, or the treatment as it's sometimes called, of a news item? And again, that's quite a probing question, because if you think, quite a lot of the world is conflict. If you think about Black Lives Matter was conflict, one point of view against another. If there's a strike, for example, on London's railways, there's conflict there. It's not violent conflict, thankfully, but you've got the managers and the workers are in conflict. So a journalist has a choice of how he or she actually looks at a story like that. Do you focus on the workers? Do you focus on the managers? Do you focus on the passengers? How much time do you give to each point of view? So there is quite a lot of thought processing that goes into journalism. So that's kind of what my interview questions are about. So like I said, don't copy my interview questions, because it all depends on what you want to find out for your dissertation. But you can use my interview questions as a guide. And like I said, think about the sequence. Think about the order in which you'll ask them. Keep them short. keep them direct, drop all the judgmental words, work with your supervisor, and you should get some good questions that will be very revealing when you ask them. So more pre-interview stuff. Slide number 12, point number 7. So the way that you find your interviewee subjects, like I said, aim high, but not too high. So you might get in touch with your local MP if you're doing something that's relevant to politics. You're probably not going to get in touch with the cabinet, Boris Johnson, and so on. But your local councillor, your local assembly member might be easier to contact. So it starts with an initial email, and use your university email address. Don't use your Hotmail address, especially if it's got a sort of amusing, jokey email name. I won't give you some examples, but I've seen some ridiculous examples over the years. So use your university email address, because that gives you a bit more credibility. You're a serious researcher. You're not just a youngster who wants to chat with somebody. Golden rule: make it short, polite, direct. So I know that I'm showing my age here, but please say dear Boris or whoever. Don't say yo Boris, or don't. It's called a salutation. It's like how you greet somebody. Make sure you use it, because a lot of young people don't. They just text message, bang. That I'm a journalist. I want to interview you. It probably won't get good results. Short, polite, and direct. And again, golden rule, the rule of threes. 3 paragraphs. First paragraph, very short, introduction, who you are, what you're doing. My name is Gary Merrill, I'm a journalism student, final year, doing a dissertation on this. That's fine. I wonder if you can help. Paragraph number 2, what you need. I would like to interview some leading journalists to understand how they write their stories. This will enable me to, get to grips with blah, 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 blah. That's your second paragraph. Third paragraph, with this in mind, could we possibly arrange to have a 20-minute chat on Skype or wherever? A good day for me is Wednesday, the 4th of November. So I've done that very quickly, but you see the point. So the first paragraph, say who you are and what you're doing. Second paragraph, say how they can help you. It's really important to give some sort of indication of how long it will take, because journalists in particular are always busy. So tell them that it will take 20 minutes or 15 minutes or whatever it might be, and give them a rough idea. Don't tell them the questions, but give them a rough idea of the information that you're trying to find out. And third paragraph, really, really important. Take the lead and suggest how you do it. Skype, 20 minutes next Wednesday or another day when you're available. Because otherwise, if you just say, if you say, I'd like to chat with you, can you suggest when we have a... And they'll get disinterested. Journalists are always busy. They're always busy, so you have to kind of nail them down. So, and again, the email interview takes some time to get right. So, so make sure that if necessary, yeah, I would say if you're doing interviews, discuss it with your supervisor. Okay, next slide. So pre-interview, slide number 13. Where, when, and how. I've put face to face, but that's not going to happen this year, is it? So the ways to do it obviously are over the phone, or Skype, or any of the other methods, that Zoom, or any of the others that we've learned to love over the past 6 months or so. I highlighted email in red there. Now the reason I've done that is that in my, again, long experience, I found that some students, what they consider an email, an interview, is that they write a big long email of questions, 6-7 questions, and they send it to a bunch of journalists, and they expect the journalists to sit down and to answer the questions one by one and send it back to them. Now in theory that's a great way, because it's really easy, right? It's convenient, you can copy and paste it, you don't have to chat to anybody, it's got loads and loads of attractions. The problem is it doesn't work, or it kind of might work, but the results you'll get will be terrible. Now the problem with email, as we all know, first problem with email is that people can ignore them, and people do ignore them, and it's just the way that it goes, because we're all busy people. And especially if I get emails every day from people I've never heard of, and they get low priority, because my top priority is my students and my colleagues. So that's the first problem, is that people avoid emails. The second problem is that if you do email questions to a journalist or somebody else, he or she is going to be able to think about them, take time to ponder their responses, and they will, if they do answer, they will write possibly really, really short, nondescript and totally uninformative answers. However, if you speak to them on the phone, face to face, Skype, Zoom, you can ask follow-on questions. You can also be more interactive, and if somebody is not answering the question, you can very politely and gently sort of coax them back into the direction where they do answer the question. So avoid email. Email's good for first contact, don't get me wrong, but to do the interview really well, you need to do it in an interactive way, which means ideally face to face, failing that over the phone, Skype, Zoom, or that sort of thing. So this is the where, when and how. So you need to decide. So when you get through to your interviewees, you need to obviously tell them where, Zoom, Skype, wherever, and when, the day, the time, obviously, and also to make sure you record it. Make sure you record it. What I do is I use my little, again showing my age, I've got a little voice recorder that if I'm doing a phone interview, I'll just put it on the table next to the phone and record it that way. And it's important, if you are recording your interview, to tell the subject that you're doing it, just as a matter of politeness. Okay, moving on. Yeah, I've jumped ahead slightly here. So slide number 14. So this is the second stage. The first 13 slides have all been about pre-interview. So you can see that there's only 22 slides in total. 13 of them, which is about, what, 3/4, have been devoted to before the interview. So just to reiterate, it's really important that you do your preparation for your interview. Otherwise, excuse me, if you don't do the preparation, then your interview potentially is going to be a disaster. And you only get one chance to do the interview. If you mess it up, if you've got an interview with a senior BBC journalist and you mess it up, they're probably not going to give you a second chance. So it's important that you do that preparation. So during the interview, so let's just go through a quick checklist. You've got the right person, you've got the questions, you've written your questions down in sequence, you've fine-tuned your question phrasing, so you're all set. So the interview begins on Skype or Zoom or the phone or whatever. And what you need to do from this point is actually, it's like the eye of the storm, because you don't actually have to do much during the interview, because all the words, all the work, if you like, is going to be done by your subject. But as I said a few minutes ago, it's really important that you record it. And in all my long years, nearly 20 years of being a university teacher, all the students I've ever met from all over the world, I've never met a single student who's got perfect photographic memory. Never, ever. I've met thousands, possibly, of students. And yet some students still come to lectures without notebooks, and they just kind of sit there and watch the show as if it's a second-rate TV program. And it's the same with interviews. You must record the interview, because people speak quickly, you might not catch what they say first time. They might come out with a fantastic quote that you've just got to put into your dissertation. So record it, either on a voice recorder or on the record function on your trusted, beloved mobile phones. And, in red, take notes as well. So when you're doing the interview, sit there with your voice recorder going, make sure it's going, obviously, make sure the red light comes on, and as a backup, make sure that you take notes too. And what I do, again, going back, showing my age, Stone Age, I print out my questions in little boxes and then write the answers, or some of the answers, in the boxes as I'm going along. That's just in case, because I have had disasters with recording equipment in the past. Never again. So I make sure that you don't write down every word, but you can write down, the general sentiment of what the answers were. And also, if you're a quick writer, you can write down a killer quote that comes out of your subject's mouth. Before you do all this, of course, make sure that you ask if it's okay to record. 99% of people will be happy with that. And if they sort of say, well, I'm not sure about that, the way to explain it is, again, what I do is I say, look, I don't do shorthand, and I want to make sure that everything that you say is accurately recorded. So it'd be really useful if I could record it, because it's all about accuracy. I don't want to misquote you. That's the point to make. Nothing sinister about being recorded. And like I said, technology, believe it or not, can go wrong. Your battery runs out or whatever it might be. And the other good thing about notes is it helps you focus. It helps you keeps you focused on what the purpose of the interview is. So that's during the interview. A few more points about during the interview. Slide number 15. There might be a temptation if the interviewee goes off at a tangent to sort of follow them. But don't forget what your mission is. Stick to the questions. So if you're asking them a serious question, second question they start talking about their vacation or something, or their latest golf match, very gently and politely bring them back to the question. There's nothing wrong with that, but just do it diplomatically. Again, it's a question of age, I guess, and experience, but it's relatively easy to do. But on saying that, I say stick to the question, but sometimes you can be too rigid with that. And it might be better, sometimes it's better to sort of listen to what they're saying, and they might take the conversation in a direction that totally surprises you, but you need to decide whether that deviation is a positive thing or a negative thing. But don't just, if they go off track a little bit, don't just assume that it's a bad thing, because it could be a positive thing. And the way that you decide, obviously, is to listen very carefully, and it's what psychologists call active listening. Instead of passive listening is when you're just slumped on the sofa watching the latest episode of the Kardashians. That's passive listening. Active listening is when you're really engaged with the conversation, what they're saying, and maybe replying or contributing to the conversation. So it sounds a bit contradictory, this piece of advice. You stick to the question, but you deviate if necessary. And it is possible to do both. So the question that you've written down determines what the information that you really want from this part of the interview. But if they start, sort of saying, oh, by the way, my boss sometimes tells me to write stories this way, don't shut them up at that point, because that's fascinating. Because journalists like to believe that they are masters of their own destiny, and they hate it when academics suggest that other forces tell them what to write. But if they start talking about that, then that could be quite productive. So like I said, it's a little bit contradictory. Stick to the question, but deviate if necessary. But I'm sure you'll understand what I mean when it happens in real life. Slide number 16. This is kind of a continuation of my previous point, and the reason I laugh is I suddenly remembered one of my interviewees. It was actually the first interviewee for my PhD, and he's a lovely guy, and I've known him for quite some time now, probably about 15 years. And he used to be the editor of a I won't say his name, but he used to be the editor of a very famous and very influential British political magazine. And I should have known, actually. He was the first person to agree to be interviewed, and so he was the person I tested my questions on, or proved my questions on. And my goodness, can that guy talk? And I was too polite to actually sort of stop him and say, could we just focus on the question that I've actually asked you? And I think it was about 3 hours in the end. And the worst thing was, we arranged to meet in a bar near the Guardian offices in King's Cross, and obviously I was paying. So that the interview itself, it kind of degenerates, in the second and third hours, because he's drinking wine like it's going out of business. So I learned by my mistake then. No, don't do it in a pub or a bar. Do it in a coffee shop or something similar. And like it says in my slide here, if your interview drones on, or your interviewee more precisely drones on or deviates too much, listen and then tell him or her gently, can you stick to the script, please? And the way to do it is to reiterate the question. You've seen journalists do it on TV, because politicians are famous for deviating. And people like Andrew Marr or Emily Maitlis, what they will do is they will sort of listen, and then they bring it back and they say, oh, can I just ask you again? Politicians are very good at avoiding questions. And journalists, once you get them talking, they do tend to enjoy talking about themselves and their work. So, but don't let them drone on too much. That's the key point, because otherwise the time will expire and you won't get through your questions. There's nothing disrespectful. It's just a matter of how you say it. There's no disrespect in saying to somebody, yeah, can I just stop you there, please? And can I just go back to my original question? So what is it that determines which stories you publish in your newspaper? Excuse me. So that's during the interview, droning on. So like I said, the interview itself is like the eye of the storm. You don't actually have to do much. What you need to do is to ask the questions sequentially, make sure they stick to the sequence, and listen and make notes and record. That's it. You don't really need to do anything else, because all of your work as an interviewer, is done prior to the interview. So post-interview, this is where the work rate has to jump up again slightly. First thing you do, as soon as you get home or as soon as you finish the interview, listen to your recordings, obviously. So don't just store them or lose them or delete them, or that's pointless. But what I do is I still use my voice recorder. I interview on my voice recorder, immediately transfer them to my desktop PC, label them all. So interview with Gary Merrill, October the whatever, question 1, I change that. I don't just have WMA 505B or whatever. Change it to question 1, question 2, and so on. And then, I know it sounds crazy, but if you can, on the same day, listen to the recordings. Listen to the recordings question by question. And if you're going to record them on a voice recorder, don't record it as one big hour-long recording. What I would suggest is that you record it per question. So question 1 is one track, if you like. Question 2 is another track. And then it's much easier to listen to. So listen to your recordings, take more notes, and what you don't want to do is transcribe them. So don't write down every word that the person says. You need to be able to listen, active listening. Listen to what they say. What's the general sentiment? Are there any killer quotes, any substantial statements within each of their answers? Because you're not going to use all their words. So you need to listen to them again to find the real substance of their contribution. So, and that will take some time. And ironically, that will take more time doing this stage number 12. That will take more time than the original interview. So don't underestimate it. But please do not transcribe it. Transcribe means word for word, verbatim. You don't need to do that. And I've seen students do it. Even though I say don't do it, students still do it. And it is pointless. It really is pointless. It's pointless. But you do need to make more notes and just understand the sequence of their comments. When you've done that, slide number 18, you need to organise the material. So what I mean by that is, if you're doing a comparative study, you might interview 5 journalists, one from each, from the BBC, Telegraph, Guardian, Mail, Sun, about the same subject, Black Lives Matter. Okay, so you've got 5 interviewees. You might have 8 questions. The next thing you need to do is sit down with Microsoft Word and start to organise your material. And the way to do it, this is the genius of the earlier idea, to write your questions in sequence. When you write your sequence of questions, think about it as the structure of an article. So for example, again, when I did my PhD, my first question was, where does news come from? Where do you get your stories from? That's the first point in journalism, is the story. An earthquake happening in Japan. That is the catalyst, if you like, for the story. So I asked the questions, or in terms of writing up my answers, that's how I explained it. It starts with the story and it ends with the reader. So you think about journalism is actually a process, isn't it? It's a sequence. It starts with an idea and it ends with the reader, when the reader or the viewer, he or she reads or views or listens to the journalism. So that's the next thing you have to do, is to organise your material using Microsoft Word. Use subheads, it works beautifully. And think about the structure of your analysis. The next slide, 19. This basically is a photograph of a piece of paper on the left there that shows all of my PhD interviewees. I think all 26 of them are there. And you might recognise some of them by their, I've used their family names here. So that's the interviewees on the left, and then the other columns, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, those are my questions. So 10 questions, as you remember, and there are 5 of them listed here. So a tick next to each person, that means that I've listened to the answers of the person listed in the first column. So for question 1, the first person is Wilby. So I listened to his. So that's the way I did it. Again, don't get freaked out by this, because this is a PhD. This is 26 journalists, 10 questions, 260 units of data, if you like. But it shows that what it shows is that I went through this sequentially and did it step by step in a very methodical way. So what I did, as I said in my comments on the right there, listened to each answer to the same question, then listened again, and I was stopping and starting and transcribing, not the whole thing, but just little bits, just killer quotes and so on, and then I started writing. What you don't want to do is listen to your interview and just write, and without putting any thought into it, because you'll just have a rambling submission in the end. And we don't want that. We don't want rambling. We want structured analysis. A couple more points before we finish. Point number 14: verbatim quotes and paraphrase. Okay, so, and I'm sure you know this because you've been doing it for the last 3 years, but when you are quoting a source in journalism, you can do one of two things. You can either quote them verbatim, so that means speech marks. So this is actually what they said. Actually what they said. You know, that is what a verbatim quote is. Alternatively, you can paraphrase. So a paraphrase is when you kind of sum up the general sentiments of what somebody says. So I'll give you an example, just a hypothetical but believable example. President Trump said, CNN produced nothing but fake news, right? So that might be what he actually said, the words that came out of his mouth. CNN produced nothing but fake news. Paraphrasing that, you might say President Trump believes that many mainstream media organisations don't tell the truth with their news. So he's kind of, that's paraphrasing, is expressing the same sentiment, but it's not exactly what they said. So if you're going to quote, so if you're going to do that, if you're going to put, you know, words in speech marks, you have to do it accurately. Don't misquote people. That's really, really bad. You know that, right? Because we've been doing that, telling you that for 3 years. And the other thing to do is to obviously blend it into the narrative. What we don't want to see is big chunks of quotation. We need to see a bit of context. Before you give us a big quotation, you need to explain a bit of background and give it some context. And again, you know this from your journalism. So essentially what I'm saying on this slide is, don't give us big chunks of verbatim quotes, a couple of hundred words of maybe, perhaps, you know, all the hesitations that people do. Okay, so that's slide number 20. And yeah, 21, what I've done there, I can't read it on my small screen, but that gives you an example and this is from my PhD. This gives you an example of how basically you write up an interview chapter. And what you'll notice there is that there are contextualizing phrases written by me, and then there are quotes and paraphrases as well from the interviewees, all blended together as a complete whole. So there you have it. And oh, hang on. Oh, not quite. We have one more slide, number 22. And just to finish off, just be aware that when you interview people, you will, by the nature of interviewing, have loads of unused material. You know, like I said, my PhD, an hour each. I may be, if you actually condense it for each of my interviewees, I may be, if that's an hour, what's that? 6,000 words. I probably used about 5% of what my interviewees actually said. So 95% of their words essentially were never used. Don't worry, it happens all the time. It happens all the time. And like I said, please, 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 don't anybody write a transcript. Do not sit down with your earphones in and say, right, I am now going to write up every single word that all my interviews said. It is a complete waste of time. You are young people, you've got your whole lives ahead of you. Do not waste time writing up interviews. The fact that you've got it recorded is good enough for us. So if we, as the teachers, need to sort of check something, we could potentially ask to hear your recording, which actually is one of the points I forgot to put on here. Make sure that if you do interviews, that you keep the recordings of your interviews somewhere safe and sound, because potentially, I've not known it happen yet at my 4 years at Roehampton, but it might come to a point where we might want to say, oh, can we just check that? So it's a good idea to keep the recordings somewhere safe and sound. So don't worry, you'll have loads of unused material. You are not expected to write up a transcript, and don't worry if you don't use the majority of what you generated. Okay, and as if by magic, that is 1 o'clock, 12 o'clock exactly. So that's 1 hour of me talking. Like I said, the video will be available. If anybody has any questions, please just throw your hand up. But the video will be available on YouTube. I'll send an email out probably later today, maybe early tomorrow, saying that the video is up on YouTube. I hope it's been useful. Point number one is really, really important, and I don't know whether this is going to be relevant to many of you, because I'm not sure what your dissertation subjects are. But if you are doing a subject which lends itself to interviews, then hopefully this lecture has been useful. Any questions, drop me a line. You can watch the video in your own time from the comfort of your own homes. I wish you all well, and thank you very much for your time and attention.